Hello again! We are back in Oscar Wilde's house. This is Lady Wilde's dining room, a fitting place to read a story I wrote, a short story inspired by my grandma Colby and her life in Minnesota and Portland, Oregon. It appears in my book, A View from the Bottom. This is called The Little Housewife. She arose before the alarm clock, put a dress over her sleeping slip, put her stockings and shoes on, and went to the kitchen. She lit the stove and boiled water for coffee, then filled her biggest pot with load after load after load of water and walked it into the backyard until the washing tub was full. She paused to start the eggs in a pan before carrying the bar of soap outside to soak the water before bringing it back in. The eggs sizzled in the cast iron frying pan as her husband got up with the alarm. He went outside with a small toolbox to work on his bicycle. She hummed to herself as she danced around the kitchen from pan to pot to sink and in and out of cupboards. She skated into the boys' room and opened the door. "Boys, you're old enough to know what time it is," she said, and walked back to the kitchen. The men of the family filed into the kitchen, washed their hands, and sat at the table. She served eggs, bacon, and toast with coffee or milk from a fresh glass bottle left on their doorstep that morning by the milkman. She sat down last but was the first up, cleaning the dishes for the sink. She rushed outside with a towel for a quick wash in the large metal washing tub. Once back inside, she went to the sink while the boys went outside to take turns getting a quick scrub in the large metal washing tub in the back strip of gravel and grass behind the two-bedroom house. When they returned, she was miraculously done with the dishes and holding out fresh clothes and lunch boxes already filled, her hair wet and combed and pinned in place to dry. "Thank you, Mother," the four boys said genuinely. She smiled and kissed each boy on the cheek in turn. As they walked out the door, she kissed her husband on the lips, and he walked out with a lunchbox, got on his bicycle, and rode off to work as the boys walked towards school. After they were out of sight, she spun around, went back into the house. She gathered everyone's laundry, took it all into the backyard, changed the water, and began scrubbing it in the washing tub with a washboard. Afterwards, she dumped the water out, then walked between the backyard and the kitchen with her biggest pot to refill the tub for rinsing. After that, she dumped the water out again, then began hanging the clothes up on the line. She walked back into the house and to the bedroom, changed out of her house dress and into a regular dress, one she could wear outside. She took the pins out of her hair and combed it, clipped on some earrings, and put on a necklace before walking back to the kitchen. Alone in the house, she looked around and made a grocery list. She had some canned beans and nothing else for dinner. They'd had $15 left over after bills by the end of the month, so she could afford to be a little spendy. She smiled at how hard her husband had been working. She wasn't used to having so much money at the end of the month. She grabbed her purse and coat and began walking to the market to buy a roast for dinner. She began to feel a little excited, knowing her boys wouldn't be expecting anything so fancy. Her husband would be happy with it, needing the nourishment after a long day at work. His new job wasn't bad, though, she thought as she walked along the park blocks, smiling at the signs of spring, birds, blooming rhododendron bushes, trillium flowers, sourgrass. It was a rare spring day without rain, and looking up at the sky, feeling for the breeze and smelling the air, she could tell it wouldn't rain for several more hours. She was very pleased knowing she could go to the market and return home without being damp and cold all day. She wouldn't make a fire just for herself. It wasn't worth the expense. She could always wait until her boys were home, and then one of them would always make it for her. And after the fire was made, they would sit up doing their homework, then listen to the latest installment of some silly radio program about space aliens or ghosts, while their father read the paper and she darned socks and patched clothes. Things were so much nicer than they had been before. The economy was good, there were jobs, food wasn't scarce, and her boys would all be able to finish school. She'd had to leave after the 8th grade, so she could work to help her mother pay for all her brothers and sisters. She'd worked 12 hours a day, 8 days a week, during the Great Depression, and lived for the duty of her family. She didn't even get to marry until she was 25, and her younger siblings were old enough to work and pay for the youngest of them. She'd gone off to the dances before then, but had never met anyone she really liked. Until that one night he had come. He'd never been there before and had only been able to make it because a friend had given him a ride into town. The town had been alive with activity. It had 2 central stores and 2 gas stations along the main street near Bemidji Lake. When their eyes met, they just knew. After that, he'd walk 10 miles into town from his family farm every week, just to see her for 2 hours at the dances, and walk 10 miles home, smiling. She always wore the same pale dress and red coat, which had belonged to her mother. He always wore the same trouser, shirt, and waistcoat, which had belonged to his father. She'd shorten the sleeves and skirt a little, though, carefully stitching it by hand in candlelight. The sleeves went above her elbows and the skirt to her knees, so when she twirled, it went just above her knees. It had been a little racy, for her family and for a small town anyway, but her coat had been long and she'd always walked home with 2 or 3 girl friends, so she'd felt it was safe enough. Things had never been easy, her father dying suddenly when she was 5, and their Catholic church demanding money from them if they wanted him buried in their cemetery. So they had to abandon that cemetery and their religion. Her aunt stealing her as a child a few times, so her mother would have to hop trains and find her to take her back home. Her mother having 2 children out of wedlock, hurriedly adopted and never spoken of. Then her mother remarrying and having no choice but to have baby after baby after baby, no matter how little food or work there was. And later she married. She and her husband living in a 1-bedroom shack while her sister stole from their firewood pile, their first baby losing its breath overnight for no reason. She'd shaken her husband awake screaming. He'd run 5 miles to the nearest hospital, but it had already been too late. And all that before the war years, when things in the economy finally got better. He could find work, they could leave the farms and make their way west. Things were looking up now. He was about to get promoted. He would be a supervisor at the little plant cleaning the Willamette River. It was easy work, he'd said, nothing backbreaking, just flipping switches. It was dangerous because it was full of electricity, but he and the other men used a 2x4 to push the switches up or down. They had just gotten a loan and would soon buy their first car and move into their first house. Not a rental, but one that they owned, with 3 bedrooms, a basement, and a garage. All their hard work was paying off, after all their sacrifices. She'd had to get an abortion the last time she was pregnant, knowing they couldn't afford to feed another mouth. If they'd had another child, they would never have been able to get a better life. It would be just like what she grew up with her mother. Of course, her mother had been a widow. They would have it better. She'd gone to cousins up in Washington and arranged a tabletop abortion while they made dinner for the family. The pain was awful, but nothing as bad as labor pains. She could handle it. She could handle anything for her family. When her husband found out, he yelled and shouted about his so-called God-given rights. She'd packed up the kids and taken a train back to Minnesota. She'd gone back to working as a waitress while she stayed with her family. She could support them all. She'd supported more siblings than she had kids. 4 months without them had shown him what it needed to. She returned and it was never spoken of again. Afterwards, one of her cousins referred her to a doctor who would agree to an operation, one so she couldn't have any more kids. It had been the only option. She'd heard a rumor that there were other ways of keeping from getting pregnant, ways doctors could help women, but there were religious men and women who wouldn't let women have them. She wasn't sure if this was true. She had no way to find out. She got the operation, had her uterus taken out. It hadn't taken her long to recover, and she was back to making dinner for her family. She made it to the market and looked around for the biggest vegetables and the juiciest roast. She was hung up at the counter as she asked after the clerk's sick mother and new baby. Her cloth shopping bags were heavy as she carried them home, breathing in the fresh air. It was so dank, and Oregon was so cold. On the thermometer it looked warmer, but it felt colder than Minnesota. It was a wet cold that got into your bones. Minnesota had much drier air, and it didn't rain so much. Oregon had hills, though, mountains, tall trees, big rivers. It seemed most things weren't better or worse than others. They were just trade-offs, she thought. And thought again of the other men she'd met at the dances, and wondered what life she would have had with him. It was a moot point by now, so there was no point in daydreaming. Besides, she was too old for all that. When she reached her street near the waterfront, she heard a phone ringing. It could be theirs, she thought. They'd just been able to afford to have a phone line put in. When she set the bags down in the kitchen, their phone began ringing. She picked it up. Hello? Yes, hello, Mrs. Kavanaugh, a young woman said. Speaking? "Are you alone?" she said with grave concern. "Why do you ask?" she said, growing nervous. "Oh dear, you'd better sit down," she said hesitantly. "Why?" she said, growing scared. It's about your husband. What? He was in an accident at work. I'm calling from the hospital." "How bad is it?" Do you have any family or friends close by? You'd better get someone to come with you, and if you have any children, you'd better get them out of school." "Oh," she said, as tears began to form in her eyes, a lump in her throat, and a pit of worry in her stomach. "Please get someone, don't come alone. And come down to St. Vincent's. Do you know where we are?" There was a silent pause. "Mrs. Kavanagh?" "Yes, I'll be there," she said, and hung up the phone. She leaned against the wall, choked on a sob she refused to let out, and steeled herself. Suddenly the roast seemed so important, the money spent on it. What if it was the last food they could afford for a while? She stumbled back into the kitchen and put the perishables into the icebox and felt dazed and disoriented for a second. Stumbling for her purse, her coat, the door, the phone, call someone? The next she knew, she was walking on Front Avenue with one of her neighbors and one of her cousins. One of them paid for the streetcar, the other assured her the principal had been called. The boys would be taken out of school. At the hospital, it was even worse than she could have imagined. Third-degree burns over 93% of his body, oil and electricity. Something about cheap, faulty equipment in the city of Portland's little river cleaning plant by Burnside Bridge. Something about how this wasn't uncommon, and she thought of cows. Cows, pigs, chickens on the farms. Of how poor people were just cattle to the rich, expendable resources. He was screaming too much and too badly injured for the doctor to let the boys see him. It wouldn't be any good for them, but she could. He would give him some morphine, then take her and let her know when it was okay to see him. The women beside her braced themselves to hold her up, as she would them, but she stood firmly, a rock in a hurricane. An eternity later, the doctor returned to say she could go see him. On her orders, one woman went, while the other stayed with the boys. He was blackened to a crisp, unrecognizable, out of his mind with pain. He didn't even know she was there. The smell of singed flesh, bandages, and antibiotic ointment was sickening. Her baby cousin cringed, looked away, covered her mouth and nose with a handkerchief from her handbag. She stood, staring. Outside the room, the doctor said, "If he lives, he'll be blind in both eyes, missing 2 legs and 1 arm." "The right or the left?" her cousin said, trying to come up with some shred of a silver lining. He was right-handed. "What difference does it make?" she said, already resigned to the fact he'd be better off dead. For as much as she didn't want to lose him, she loved him so much she'd never want for him to suffer like that. And how could they afford it anyway? One more mouth to feed, and one that couldn't get a job. Whether he lived or died, it was hopeless. They walked slowly back to the waiting room. She didn't want to upset her boys, but their eyes were mirrors. The horror on her face told them all they needed to know and shone back at her. She wanted more than anything to protect them from this, to never let them feel the pain she had as a child. They were her baby. She wanted to wrap her arms around them and shelter them from this, tell them he'd be okay, everything would be okay, or at least that they could see him to say goodbye in case it went that way. But she was powerless against this force. Her arms hung there, useless. Her oldest boy, not yet out of high school, would be the man of the house now. She'd wanted so badly for him to just be free, to look for work, maybe take on an apprenticeship and make good money so he could get a good wife. But now? Her youngest was so close to his dad, how would he cope? Their father, having known he was the last baby they'd ever had taken extra time for him. "Well," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "there's nothing we can do here, so we may as well go home." "But Mother," her oldest began. "Don't argue with me. I'm your mother. I know what's best. You're the oldest. You have to make sure your brothers stay on track with their schoolwork. And none of us has eaten in hours. I'll have to cook that roast." I got a roast at the market," she said, and trailed off. "We can cook the roast," her cousin assured. "Well, in any event, it has to be cooked tonight. The Iceman won't be back until next week, and there's no reason to let good food spoil. There are people who don't have food. Waste not, want not," she insisted before marching them out of the hospital. Together they walked all the way home. It would cost too much to take the streetcar back with all 7 of them. At home, the women worked in the kitchen. The 2 guests skittered around the house to make sure all the other chores were also caught up so she wouldn't have to do anything, but everything was already done. Her eldest called classmates to ask about homework and made sure they all stayed caught up on their schoolwork. They ate in silence by the warmth of a fire. The guests washed the dishes while she put her boys to bed, even knowing they would not sleep. She knew the key to surviving any family disaster was routine. Go to school or work, do your job, be responsible. The youngest stayed up by the fire, tending to an injured cat he'd found by the road. He was sitting at the foot of his dad's chair, but not in it. She let him stay there. Eventually he drifted off to sleep. In the wee hours of the morning, she got the call. He was dead. They made sure to recommend a closed casket for the funeral. And there it was. The world shattered again. The earth pulled out from under her. Everything was up to her. She would work. There was no alternative. She could waitress again or do maid work. Not much else with an 8th grade education. But she would never let her family down. She went into the bathroom and ran water to drown out the sound of her sobs, but kept track of the time with her old scratched wristwatch because come 7 a.m., it would be time to start breakfast, set the day's routine, make sure the boys went to school. Her determination would have to keep them all together, even if the whole world fell apart. Thank you for watching.